Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Creative Goo, sponsored by Gooey Q. I'm Harry, I'm your host, and we're going to talk about all things creative with tabletop gaming with an RPG focus. I do have a guest today. Let me introduce Belinda. Hey, Belinda, why don't you talk about your painting journey?
All right, so I'm going to preface this with a big old amateur stamp on everything that I do. This really came about because we are huge tabletop gamers and we got tired of random things on a map. And I said, hey, let's try to do some painting. And my lovely husband, Brad, said, hey, I totally support that. And bought my first army painter kit and found that I really, really loved it. And it's been a little journey from then. I am nowhere near competition based. This is absolutely from a love of painting standpoint, no competition based here. Just to give you some tips, tricks, and trades for everyone that it's kind of the I already tried this and let me tell you what I found works kind of momentum.
Yeah, I love that. And for all of you listening in, Belinda and I talked, and we really think people should understand that painting miniatures is accessible to everybody, maybe with the exception of someone visually impaired. But everybody else, you can paint, have fun, and create some nice looking miniatures. So, anything you want to add, Belinda?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that if you are interested in it, give it a try. It can be very meditative. It can be very stress reducing. It's just fun to see what you can do. I remember the first time that I painted a miniature, I was very concerned and worried and thinking, well, this is not going to look right. And it's been a great journey just to do it and fun. Have fun while you do it, because I think a lot of times you watch too much stuff out there, and it can be very convoluting to the process. I know this, but it's a lot of fun, and you never know what you can do until you do it. You don't have to be a painter. You don't have to be an artist to do this. There's a lot
Yeah,
of things out there that help.
Yeah, I agree 100%. There are techniques you can learn that will work really well in miniature scale. And you can learn those techniques and make great miniatures. Some of the techniques I learned while the earth was still cooling, people don't use anymore. But there's some new paint materials, speed paint, contrast paints that make it easier. The undercoats that you use make it easier. Brushes, everything's better basically than from when I started. And so I think it's even more accessible now than it was when I started painting.
And I think too is that it really is about what you're going to put into this. You don't have to buy the best. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars buying what someone says is the best thing or anything else. It really comes down to what makes you comfortable as a painter. So it doesn't matter if it's homegrown, if it's something that you built yourself, or it's the top of the line something. It all is dependent on how you feel comfortable as a painter. That's it. Worry about yourself first. The rest will come.
And then you want to think about why you're painting miniatures, right? So it's for an enjoyment, it's so you can make it like you want it, and it's for your gaming at your table, or as a gift, or all those things. And all of that can inform the effort you put into it. Some people go all the way and they want to be a competitive painter, but most of us, that's not why we paint.
Mhm.
So, Belinda, why don't you talk about, you know, what it took to get started, what techniques you learned, and maybe we can talk through those techniques a little bit.
Yeah, I think for me, the big part was getting started. Like I said, I bought an army painter set to start. I'd watched a lot of YouTube and I saw the wet palette. The wet palette was probably the first thing that I was truly invested in because I knew I was going to be a slow painter. I wasn't going to be just like slapping out miniatures, and wet palettes really gave you the option of keeping paints as fresh and vibrant as you could over a long period of time without having to worry about all those paints drying up and everything else. So that was one of the first big things that I found. Doesn't mean that you always have to use a wet palette. There are other things that you can use, but to give yourself the freedom of kind of making mistakes and everything else and not worrying about wasting paint, which paint's not it's it's not super expensive, but it's also not cheap if it's you're just wasting through it. So that was one of my things to start out with. Another was making sure that your miniatures that you're working with are primed and ready. Uh,
Yeah, that's super important. So let's pause on that so we can explain what priming is. So
okay.
a miniature comes in metal, plastic, resin, and a PVC material. So you need to know whether it's been primed in advance or not. So WizKid sells miniatures, they're pre-primed. So thumbs up, you can paint them right away. Most of the other miniatures, you need to apply a coat of primer before you add your colors. And the primer needs to work with that material. And so most of the spray primers out of a rattle can work on metal, plastic, and resin. Not going to be so good on the Reaper bones or even on those WizKids miniatures because that PVC material reacts with the chemicals in a rattle can. So, but you need to prime. And what it
Yeah.
does is it prepares the surface of the material to take paint. And it gives it what chemists call teeth or tooth. So there's something for the paint to bind to. And so priming miniatures is a pro technique. You really need to do that to get the effects you want. And it keeps it from getting chipped, paint rubbing off, and
Mhm.
for the vibrant color or the color to work the way you expect.
Yeah.
And there's some fancy ways to do priming, but a base coat of a primer is required. The advanced techniques we can talk about deeper into the show.
Yeah. I mean, you have to think of it like this. You're not going to paint the walls in your house without priming those walls and not expecting chipping and plastering and those effects. It's the same thing for your minis. You're going to have to put something on there that's telling that paint where to go. It's that porous surface that says, "Hey, my paint stays here." And it doesn't spread out all over the place. And we'll talk about like thinning and stuff like that because all paints react a little bit differently. But that primer is definitely where you're going to see it. And if you don't think that, take one mini that's unprimed and one mini that's primed and do the same paint job, and you'll see it. They just run all over the place if it's not primed. So that's definitely the first thing, and it's the first thing that will help you not be frustrated with your painting.
And we don't want to go into detail on the wet palette right now, but
Okay.
if you have questions about it, we'll certainly answer those. But I'd really like to talk more about after you prime your miniature or what's next.
Yeah. So after you prime the miniature, depending on your priming technique, and we can talk about like zenithols and things like that. So the first thing you're going to look at is what your base coating is because you're not doing this kind of as a finished piece of art. So you're not doing, well, here's the face, here's the coat, here's the cloak, here's that. You may be doing an overall skin tone. You may be doing an overall, I want this kind of effect to be on the these are the leather parts, these are the parts that are metal, these are the parts that are this. You're not going right in there and being super super detailed in what you're doing right off the bat, because you're going to be layering this paint. And that's one of the things with painting, is that you're going to be layering. So don't worry on that first coat if things are off a little bit, things move in different directions or anything else, because you're going to be coming back and putting things on top and doing more detail work later on. You're not worried about the details in that first layer.
So let me expand on that a little bit too. So you want to look at the miniature and see what a plan is, right? How you want this to look, but also where you're going to be putting that paintbrush. So, for example, if the coat is underneath other things, you might want to paint it first, because it's going to be hard to get in there when you're painting something else, right?
Yeah.
So don't paint it. There was advice in the old days: paint in the order you dress. Then there was paint from the inside out. But really, it's looking at the miniature and paint the hard to get places first, or make them dark, like with a black, and then
Yeah.
paint what you can see. So that first coat is planning out the miniature. So you might want to lay down your base colors: the shirt, the pants, the boots, the face. And if you're using a contrast type paint, that might even go faster, but we'll talk about that more. But that it's usually called a base coat. And
Yeah.
go ahead, Belinda.
Yeah. Yeah, and that means like taking the miniature and turning it around, turning it upside down, because you're going to have things like the back part of the cloak. You're going to have the inner thigh and stuff like that. That's not necessarily going to be super important for the overall look, but if it's missed, it's really apparent that it happens. And you're never going to be super detailed. I mean, I'm talking as an amateur painter here. You're never going to be like, well, I need to make sure that that inner thigh is exactly the same leather color as everything else. You're just making sure that it's not super gray or super white or whatever that you primed with, that everyone goes, hey, well, I totally see that their pants are not the same color the whole way through. And sometimes it is turning them over. And I know we can talk about this. Light is an important factor in this, because depending on the light that you're playing with on the table, depending on the light that you're using when you're painting a mini, it can change the shadow factors on that mini. So being able to turn that mini over and take a light and say, yep, I see it. There's a big gray spot right there, and I need to make sure I get it. And like Harry said, doesn't have to be exact. It can be gray, it can be black. It's anything that kind of cuts out the light feature, so that if you turned it over, you wouldn't be like, well, obviously this mini is missing something because of this spot that no one is really going to pay attention to. Even though, really, if you're turning over a mini and trying to find every spot that's not painted, then you need to be a painting judge.
Well, maybe they're turning it over for a different reason. So,
Yeah.
I don't
If
want to
they're going
ascribe
prone,
names.
yeah, I know. Well, I mean, you could have a character that's going prone, or something like that, and you have those empty spaces that it
They'll
doesn't
show,
necessarily seem.
yeah, they'll show up. The other thing you want to be sure you understand is, what are you going to use this miniature for? And so as you're painting, if it's going to be on display, maybe on a high shelf, that underneath is super important, because people look up at it all the time. If it's going to be on the table, they're going to be looking down at it all the time. If you want people to look at it up close because it's your favorite miniature, you're going to paint it differently. And so all those things matter, and the color is going to show up different in different light. So I paint with very bright light because I have bad eyes. When we
I do the same
game,
thing.
we don't game with a bright light. I mean, the room that we're gaming in doesn't have very good light. In fact, I had to put in a little small desk light so I could read my material. So the miniatures just look totally different.
Hmm. Yeah. And I would say, because I paint in a super bright light as well, because I would rather paint to high definition bright light than to paint to dark. Because if I paint to dark, my paint's going to be dark, everything's going to be very muted. And then anytime you get it in any type of contrast light, you're going to be like, I don't see the difference in your paint. It all looks blacks and grays. But I do say, hey, if you are painting in bright light, make sure that you take it. I take mine a lot and take pictures of it in different light. So I take it out to where the gaming table is going to be and turn on the kitchen light and look at it underneath the yellow light. I open up the blinds and I look at it in natural light. And all of those things can help you make those shades better because you're not focusing on just bright light focus. You're looking at it from those different light aspects.
Absolutely. The other things to keep in mind is a camera will capture things the human eye does not. That can be good, but it also can be bad because you focus on what the camera sees. No one else is going to see it unless you show it on the internet.
Yeah.
But be aware of that. And then different color light does affect what you do. And what you want to build is like muscle memory of how those colors are going to work. So you don't have to take every miniature outside to see how it looks. You'll build that muscle memory over time of how yellow is going to look, how red, because those are really difficult colors to make look good when you're doing your shading and your highlighting. And
Yeah.
which leads to, after I've done the base coat, Belinda, what do I do?
Oh gosh. Um, I don't know. I don't know what you call it. I'm an amateur painter.
So what do you do after you've got that shirt and cloak and face done? What do you do next?
What I usually do is then I'm looking at definition. I'm looking at highlight features. Um, so, I mean, you can do some highlights after the fact, but there are some things like you do base coating and you look at those things and you're like, this has got to be lightened up. So you might be using a contrast paint to get to making definition within that. So you do the cloak in blue, and you know that's not how light plays on it. Light doesn't just play on blue and it just looks like blue and it doesn't change. You're going to have contrast within those folds that's darker blue, light blue, and stuff like that. So I start to think about how light is playing on the mini and where that light is going to be seen in the paint. So I might be doing a layer to either accent a color that's already there, or then I'm trying to build those layers into the base that I already have. I'm not sure if that's what you do, Harry. That's kind of what I do. So,
Well, let's keep it simpler, right? So we're talking about like, so after you have that base coat, you could be done, right? You could put that on the table and play with it.
yeah.
But what most of us do is want there to be depth, and you want to show the features of the miniature, like the folds in the cloak or the armor they're wearing, things like that. And so it's highlighting and shading. Now you can highlight and shade using color. So if I've got a blue cloak, I might have purple inside, or a highlight with a yellow or a pink even, and that cloak's going to look amazing. I can also do what Belinda said is maybe do a dark blue on the inside and then find a way to put a light blue on the edges. That's the traditional technique. And there's other techniques to accomplish both of those things. Phantom online here says he would do a wash. Well, that's another way to do it. You thin the paint very, very much, or you get a special wash out of a bottle and you brush it on, and it goes into those recesses automatically, right? And gravity will pull it to the bottom. And so if light's coming from the top, that works really nicely. And then for highlighting, you could do a dry brush. where you take most of the paint off the brush and you just catch the
Yeah.
raised areas.
Yeah.
That technique works really, really well. It does sometimes get chalky or leave marks that you don't want. So it takes some finesse. And then there's other techniques that you can do too, where you would mix a lighter color with your blue and then just draw those lines directly. The
Yeah.
contrast paint Belinda mentioned is a product. So Games Workshop makes what's called contrast paints. Um, the Army Painter Paints make something called Speed Paint, and then Vallejo has a line that does something similar. And what
Yeah. And
they've done,
Citadel also has a line that's like that as well.
mhm. And what they do is there's a chemical they put in the paint, and what happens is the most of the color will go into those recesses. It's very, very thin, and it pulls away from the edges. And if it's white underneath, that white shows through. It's very translucent paint. So with one coat, you get shading, base color, and highlight.
Mhm.
And they call it speed painting. There's other things for it, but
Mhm.
I use that a lot nowadays.
Yeah.
It's faster. For most parts of the miniature, it's one coat and I'm done. And it really has made painting a joy for me again. And I know a
Yeah.
lot of painters that feel the same way, that it's just made it more fun to paint.
And I think too is that a big thing here is the time, because even if you're using something like speed painting, contrast paints, and everything else, and I know that I've done this a lot of times, is you don't want to rush it too much because you're going to get this blending effect that you don't want to happen. So make sure you're allowing that time to dry between layers, even if you're doing that base and then you're adding that contrast or you're adding that wash. If you don't let things set appropriately, that yellow is going to bleed into the red, it's going to bleed into the brown, and even your contrast will start to clump up and do weird things on a mini if you're not allowing it that time to rest. So there's no paint that's a 2 minutes and you're in, done, and out. Okay, speed paints are a little thicker, which means that they are not meant to have to put multiple layers upon layers upon layers, which is kind of the traditional. I put this layer on, I let it dry, I come back, I do another layer, I let it dry, I do another layer. And speed paint says, hey, I ain't got time for all that. So I'm getting more out of that initial layer that I'm putting on. And then when I go back in and do more layers, I'm getting more out of the paint at that time, which is why it's a speed paint, because I'm not having to thin down and reduce and do over and do over and do over. But at the same time, you can't rush through speed paints either and not let it dry appropriately, because red and yellow are going to make orange no matter what you do. If you rush it, red and yellow are going to make orange, and you may not want orange. And then if you muddle it all up, it's going to be brown.
Yeah, if you add a third color, it becomes brown. Absolutely. So I love that. I think that's great advice, is to let it rest. Now, if you're not using one of those speed paints, you can blow on the miniature or use a hair dryer and it will
Yeah.
dry fast. Now, the speed paints, that air will move the paint where you don't want it. So that doesn't work today and nowadays. So I often have more than one miniature I'm painting at the
Oh, yeah.
same time.
Yeah, I was gonna say that too, is to think about what you're gonna do in your paint session. I know that I've done a lot of stuff where I've been like, I was painting something for an Avernus, and we were doing a lot of devils. And so it was like, hey, I'm going to be doing a lot of devils. I'm going to do a lot of devils of the same sort. And even different types of devils tend to have kind of the same color scheme. So you could literally have all of these devils laid out and do your base, your base, your base, your base, your base. By the time this last one is done, you're ready to start the next layer of that first one. And now you're getting, sometimes depending on what you're doing, you're painting armies, you can do 10, 20, 30 of these because you have planned out your color scheme and you planned out what you're doing, but you can vary it up. There's nothing saying that every one of these has to be the same. You can decide that one is going to be more yellow, one is going to be more orange, one is going to be more red. But as long as you've got that palette out there ready to go, you can make those variations once you get that base done.
Perfect. Do you want to show some of those pictures you have?
Sure. I won't claim, like I said, don't claim to be um, super great, but we will see what kind of happens.
Yeah, first we have to test the technology.
Yeah, that's always great. Let's do this. And let me hit share.
Nope, I'm seeing it.
Okay.
So tell
So
us
this
about this one.
all right. So this is one of my first bust models that I did. I see a lot of things now. I mean, it's like you look back and you go, "Oh my goodness! Like I could have done this or that." There's a few things though that I do like. I like the definition in the horns. So you have kind of the outer ridges of the horns that have kind of a gold, and then the rest kind of blends into her hair, goes back into the black. There's some lighting that's done on her face. I think dynamic colors here can be it can be hard. It can be hard coming up with what you want the colors to be. Uh, because you go too bland and everything bleeds into one another. And sometimes what you're looking at is like that contrasting color combo. Um, but some things here, I mean, we can talk about eyes. There's not a lot of definition here in the eyes. Like there's not blue pupils or anything else, but there's definitely a look in the eyes without having to be super great at that because I am not.
Yeah,
Um,
before we talk about eyes, Belinda, I want to
yeah.
talk about that contrast a bit. So first, contrast is used in lots of different ways in miniature painting because there's a
Mhm.
product called contrast paints.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about here is the contrast between one color and another. And
Mhm.
so I want to highlight for everybody what really works here. So she has this bluish, purplish skin tone. And then contrasting with that is that brown leather against all of her skin. And then on the other side of that brown is that turquoise. And that's the perfect use of contrast because it's delineating from one color to another to a third. If you had done like a dark purple for that accent, there wouldn't be enough contrast and the
Mhm.
eye would struggle. Or if you made her that shirt material brown, then it would look like just one blouse piece, and you wouldn't
Mhm.
realize that she had that, you know, border and that bustier area. And so this is a really good way to use color to highlight the details of a miniature and allow the eye to recognize the details. And this would
Yeah.
work really well at an inch tall as well.
Yeah. And it's taken too into the fact the little imp on her side is very different in color combo. So it really draws that out that he's different. He's his own little being in this. So overall, this was one of these I was really happy with after it was all said and done. She started out blue skinned, and then she was red skinned, so she went through several different levels there before I decided that the purple looked really good.
Yeah, no, I think the final result is really strong, especially as we talk about contrast. And when I was entering competitions, I was hit a lot because I wasn't putting enough contrast between those three layers. because I was looking for this hyper realistic look, and it just didn't read.
Yeah. And sometimes that's a real struggle, because I struggle with that. Is that sometimes I'm like, I know what stone looks like, but then you do it and you're like, well, here's another one um, that I did. And you have to think about that composition. It's hard to see the back because the snakes have that golden uh, on it as well, but you can see just in her shirt there's some contrast there that it looks like a metal shirt that she has on. This one, I think the challenge was the flesh, her skin overall was a big issue, and making those snakes seem like they were part of her body, overall, and like sticking to that theme. So it's green. Her necklace has some green. Her lipstick is green. The eyeshadow is green, and the snakes are green. That kind of tie it in. That this is kind of like part of who she is overall.
Yeah, what I find amusing is if I had 50 guys doing this miniature, they wouldn't have given her eyeshadow.
Yeah,
So that's something a
yeah,
woman would automatically think of, and a guy has to actually process to do something like that.
yeah.
But I think it works really well here, and you can actually see the eyelid. There's a line in your eyelid before it gets under your eyebrow, and you can
Uh-huh.
see that even here in the photo. And I'm looking at it from far away. And here's a good place to talk about eyes.
Okay. Yeah, I think sometimes you can get really caught into this because from this, you're thinking, well, she looks like she has definition in the eyes, but literally, this is a white background with black and a little splash of white to show how light is hitting her eyes. There's no color in her eyes. They're not green, they're not blue. They, you don't see irises or anything else like that. But from this angle, she looks like she has a defined eye.
Yeah, I think that's the first lesson about eyes we want to focus on. And that is, what are you going to see? So even as a bust on the table, would anybody be able to distinguish if she had green or blue eyes? And the answer is no. And so putting that effort in is great if you're zooming in with a camera. But if you're putting this on display in your home, nobody's going to notice. The second thing is you just want it to read like an eye. So the white of your eye and then the black is plenty. And then if you want, adding a white dot in the black just pops on a miniature this big. And you don't need the color of the iris. And so this is really important for people. You don't have to overthink it. You don't have to overpaint it. You don't have to make a production and constantly repaint to get it perfect. Now, a lot of miniature painters have crazy eyes. So you look at the mini, they're looking in weird directions, or one eye's bigger than the other. I have plenty of miniatures like that. And it's because I just kept trying and trying and trying. And so there's techniques you can use to make the eyes the same to get this kind of result for a regular sized miniature.
Yeah, I think a lot of times is that it's very intimidating because you can watch painters on YouTube who are just doing fantastic things with eyes. I'm not interested in that, and I've had to let go of that long ago. I'm interested in the overall appearance, not necessarily having that definition there. So, and I think sometimes is that you can get so lost in that very minute detail that you sacrifice a lot of other things with the mini, or you're not happy with it and you're like, well, I'm done, this is over, it's not going to happen. Even in this other mini here, She doesn't have a fully defined eye. It's just like it's black, and then I put a little bit of white toward the end to make it kind of look like she's looking over to the side, but not focusing on detail
Do
in
you
the eye.
do you have a regular size miniature where we can see the eyes?
Yeah, let me see if I can.
I
Let
think
me
these
see
were
if I.
great to showcase what you do, but these are busts, so they're a little bit bigger. And
Yeah, let
and
me.
Phantom less can be more, absolutely. In fact, I have miniatures with no eyes painted. They're not key figures on the table. They're usually villagers or guardsmen, soldiers like that. So I just don't even put that effort in. And then other miniatures, yeah, very quick, just hint of an eye.
Okay, so here's one. It's kind of hard to see, but as you can see, it's just like black slits.
Yep. Yeah, that works
It,
well for a lot, especially the brooding male miniatures. Black slits all you really need. How did you paint that? I mean, how do you paint the eyes?
so I use a very fine brush and a lot of hopes and prayers that I don't just go plopping. You need very little paint in that brush, and that's another thing as far as when you're using brushes, is that you don't necessarily have to load it up with lots of paint, especially when you're trying to do eyes. You may have it like, lined out, and you're like just barely doing a speck and see where it goes from there. That's what I usually do is I see what happens. But I don't load that paintbrush up with a lot of paint, because then you're going to get the, Jack, paint me like one of your miniatures with the wonky eyeballs.
So let me give you some cheats. The
Yes.
first is let me change screen so we can both be in the picture. All right. So I have in my hand here, let's get in front of the camera, a felt pen with a very fine tip. Press that like a pencil, a dot. Those are two black dots, perfectly round.
Yeah.
You have a round eyeball. Now you only want to do that if you have the eye, if you have the eye, the white part. If you're going to do just that slash of black, you can use the pen or you can use a brush just to do that black line. Now the ultimate cheat is to paint the eyes first, right? So all you need is white paint, a straight line from top to bottom, because you paint and you hold the miniature so that you're drawing a line where your hand's going from top to bottom. And you can cover half the face, doesn't matter, because you're going to paint flesh over it.
Yeah.
The second thing you do is a very small line straight up and down, right? Then you take your flesh tone, preferably a darker one, and you do a straight line, a top and bottom and nose. Now you use your lighter flesh tone to do everything else you're going to do in the face, because you can do a straight line almost with your eyes closed, because your hand will just move just naturally in that straight line. So you get white, black, and a darker flesh tone for under the eyebrows and under the eye. And there's fancy things you can do, but those give you almost perfect eyes that look the same on both sides every time.
Yeah. And two, the minis, when they're printed, have the indention for the eyes. So you're not having to create eyes out of thin air. They're there already in that printed version. So sometimes you're just letting the paint fall into the
That's
place it
absolutely
needs.
true.
Instead of forcing it. I probably have one. Let me see.
And while you're looking, so the pen I use when I paint after I painted the face, and I use when I'm just using the white slash black pen, and then I can take that little dot. Let me change scenes
Okay.
so we can see
All
it.
right. Okay,
You're good.
no, you go ahead. Are
And
you good?
so, yeah, I'm good. Go ahead. So the reason I do it first is because it takes the stress off, right? And then once you have the eyes the way you like it, then you paint the rest of the face, and it's not so hard. It's not so stressful. Then you can highlight your cheekbones and your nose and give them a shine on the forehead, whatever you need to do, and your eyes are good. So
Yeah.
we see this elf you've got.
This is literally the first mini I ever painted.
Looks really good.
Yeah.
It's really
So,
good.
I mean, nothing fantastic here. It's one of these I'd like to go back and paint her again just to see what's gotten better. But you can see the eyes are just like little, there's nothing defining here. Because I think some people can get so caught up in that angle of it. Right now, I mean, is it defined? It's defined enough. To me, you can tell she has eyes. She looks like she's looking in a certain direction. There's nothing here that's off putting in the eyes. Like you don't look at it and go, well, that's not natural. It's very standard. There's
Mm-hmm.
it just is what it is. Like you don't have to worry about that super level of definition. If you placed her on the game today, no one would be going, well, her eyes don't look real. You know, well, she's an elf. You know,
The other
what?
way to think about it is when you buy a pre-painted miniature, how does that face look? And
Yeah,
some of them look horrendous, right? So painting it yourself is already better.
yeah,
And that can be the standard for people. Is it better than that Wizards of the Coast pre-painted fantasy miniature or Mage Knight? And WizKids has pre-painted now too. And
yeah,
some of them are nice, but most of them, it's very simple paint job.
yeah. And if you think about it, like a mini like that on the table is, do you feel any less affected by that mini? Like if she were to pop out of the woods and say, "Hey, I want you to go on a quest," are you looking and going, "Well, she's only got like little black dots for eyes. Apparently, we can't trust her." No, you're not. You're you're moving on with life. You're not focused like, well, she doesn't have a delineated iris, so apparently we can't trust her. She must be evil. No, nobody's thinking that. Not when you're used to playing, especially with people that sometimes a Hershey kiss is the bad guy. Like people are not that invested overall. Now, when it comes to painting people who say, this is my character and I want them to look certain ways, my whole thing is don't tell me you want them to have certain eyeballs. It ain't going to happen. Okay. Tell me you want them to wear a purple cloak. You want them to have a pink hat. You want them to have red hair. Don't say they got blue eyeballs. Nope, you can tell me that in the story when you're playing because I'm not going to paint blue eyeballs on your tiny little miniature that's like this. It ain't going to happen.
So I often paint miniatures. Well, I'll sculpt miniatures for my characters too, but I'll paint them, and so they get to use their character and see it every day when they play.
Mhm.
But I'm the same way. I can paint pretty well, so that they get a lot of good out of it. Sometimes they're disappointed. I'm like, here's an option for you. Here are 5 professional painters I know that you can pay to paint it just like you want.
Oh,
But
yeah.
for free, this is what you get.
This is what you get. Exactly. Like I'm not making money off of this. I'm doing what I need to do, and I try to uphold. I mean, the one that was the ball headed uh, Goliath was someone's character, and it's been one of the favorites of the table the whole time because he actually has a shine on his little bald head.
Yep, yep, that's
So,
really cool.
sometimes it's not about the eyes. It's not about like that their boots look a certain way. Sometimes it can be, I never thought the shine in his bald head was going to be the selling point of that mini, but it was.
Yeah, oftentimes it's their gear, their equipment, their weapon they're using. Those are what people want to see on the table. So again, you don't have to overthink this.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
and if it's on the gaming table, the closest you're getting to it is 2 feet. Now, obviously, some people pick it up and look at it, and that's cool. But 2 feet is going to be the average. And so, how is it going to show 2 feet away? Sometimes four or
exactly.
more.
And I know it's hard to see on this guy, but that one knee that's closest to the axe is silver because this person wanted him to have like a brace, like he had a knee brace on. He's old, he's been around for a little bit, and that was a thing for him. Like he was like, I love this because he's got that silver brace on his knee, so it doesn't match the other side. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but again, it comes down to that it was never the eyes that mattered here. It was the way the armor looked, like the gold trim on the armor. You can't see it from the back, but his fur that's back here looks like a recently skinned animal. That was important to him. There's a little bit of blood on his axe and knife. These were the things that were important. It was not the eyes. It was never the eyes.
How do you do metal?
Oh, metal. So first off, if you're using a wet palette, never put your metal paints on a wet palette. They will eat right through that into the layer that's underneath and just spread out into a goo. I use the little paint trays that had the little divots and put a little bit of paint in there. And I usually, depending on what I'm doing, I like to really outline armor in the metallics instead of just doing full on metallics for armor. I like to do a little bit of a darkening to the actual armor pieces. Then I like to go in with that metallic on the ridges and highlight that. But I always do it in those little trays, or if you're using Citadel paints that are in the pots, just opening the pot up because a little bit of ink will sit right there in that little well, and you can just dip your paintbrush in there and just lightly. You don't even have to like really paint. It's almost kind of like you're just brushing the brush along those ridge lines to get that definition to the metal.
Interesting. So, if you want to paint something metal, the whole thing, there's a couple of things you can do. The first is you want to start with a dark color, black, dark blue, whatever. Because if you use a light color, the metal doesn't work. It just doesn't show. You might get a reflection or something, but from 2 feet away, it's going to be difficult to identify it as metal. So both gold and silver colors should go over a dark. The other thing you do that I do is after it's painted, you do a wash. And so there's some that are specifically designed for metal, armor washes and things like that. Those work really well. There's some washes from that same company you use, Army Painter. There's like dark tone, strong tone, light tone, or even colors like green tone. And
Yeah,
that will go into the recesses and give you a little different look. Like blue works really well, like on a breastplate. That
yeah,
blue will be in recesses and you get this really bluish steel.
yeah,
But those are the techniques you can use. Something I used to do a long, long time ago with chainmail is black and then that dry brush of steel over it, and it just pops and it looks really nice. Other people will look at it and go, "Oh, you did was brighter up, all you did was dry brush," and it's like it looks cool. What's your damage, And
yeah,
so those are techniques for metals. There is an advanced technique called non-metallic metal. And what
yeah,
you're doing is you're painting with light, so the darks and tones, to make it look like metal using non-metallic paint. I
yeah,
don't do that. I know how, but That's something if you want to become an advanced painter to look at. But I
Yeah.
use metals, and Army Painter now has speed paint with silvers and golds
Yeah.
and steel. And I'm going to buy those. I haven't had them yet, and I'll tell people how they work. And so
Yeah.
it's the one coat, dark to light. Um, but so there's lots of different choices. The other thing to think about is if I look at a soldier today, or even let's say in World War II, they
Yeah.
had a metal helmet, but you didn't see metal. They painted it a dark green or a blue. And so painting armor with a color and then doing the touches like Belinda's talking about would look really, really cool and have its feet in reality. People paint armor all the time, paint metal. When you have a car, it doesn't look like steel, it's been
Yeah.
painted. And you can weather it so that they can tell there's metal underneath. There's techniques for that, but just don't be afraid to have a red armored knight.
Yeah. And you have to you what just like with the Goliath that was shown is that the parts that are shiny are the parts that are probably getting worn more. He's buffing up against something, so there's always something kind of rubbing on that brass part that's kind of keeping a little bit shiny. Most people are not buying new armor constantly, so that patina, that dirt, that grime that's getting in there. So there's nothing wrong with having some darkness
Yep,
to that armor and then having these highlights of brightness to show the use of it, because it's not normal. Unless you're a god floating from the heavens wearing your angelic breastplate of majesty, you're probably not going around, or you're a guard with very little to do in Darkenhaven. Uh, are you just walking around with your gleaming metal armor? If you're an adventurer, you're probably either buying the armor that you can find, or it's the well worn stuff that you've gotten from wherever. So the stuff that's really bright on there is the stuff that's rubbing up and constantly being in battle, or you're kind of taken care of, but it's usually not the whole thing. And it's really contrasting. It doesn't make sense. If you look at something that you paint completely gold, it's gross looking. There's no definition. So sometimes that's where shadow washes and things like that. Things
mm-hmm.
are those washes that get into those crevices and kind of dirty it up. You just got to be sure you're very thin with it to start out with, because it can get dirty real quick. And now you're like, well, I've lost all the vibrancy in that. But, again, you got to think about what is actually happening in the model, instead of just being like, I really like this gold metal paint. It looks really cool. And thinking about how is it actually affecting the armor that the character is wearing.
Absolutely. And you can have the character drive your decisions. So that veteran of multiple wars with his armor, or that guy that goes into dungeons and crawls through the muck, it's going to be very grimy. And then there's that paladin, the paladin that's constantly polishing his breastplate because he wants everybody to see him from a mile away. It's going to look different. And
Yeah.
now on the tabletop, you can tell the difference between those two characters, and it becomes part of the story. Uh, all of that's really fun, and it gives you a reason to paint and some fun things to do. What do you do about skin tone, Belinda? As we wrap up, do you do everybody in a similar skin tone that you have? I know that's really common for people. Are you trying to do multiple skin tones to represent different kinds of people?
Yeah, I really like experimenting with the skin tones. I think it's easy to go very fair skin if you're used to being fair skin, because you can look down at your own skin and go, well, it matches, and it makes you feel realistic. But I really challenge people to go in there and add a golden hue to something. Take a little bit of a tan and put it in there. Like with tieflings, you have that luxury that you don't necessarily have to be super realistic with that skin tone. And it's a really good way to learn different lighting, the way that shades change things without you being like, well, I was trying to go for more of a Latin feel to the skin or something like that, and you went too far or you went too less. I think it's one of those things you can, that's again why I like a wet palette, because I can put a whole lot of things out there and then dib and dab into those things to get where I want. And I can use my own skin tone. I can put that against there and be like, yeah, that's where I was going with it. To not just match what's here on my skin. I can take a look and like take my paintbrush and mix some things and then put it on here and be like, yeah, this is where I'm going.
Yeah, I love that. The other thing is not all goblins are green, orcs aren't always green, those kinds of things. So play with skin tone. Not all humans are the same color, and to play with that. And so I think that's really important, but it's also something we want to encourage people to do. It's true that painting manufacturers had skin tones that were based on fair skinned people. Now there's more options today, but there's no reason you can't mix your own and mix and match. Have that tiefling be a lavender skin as a base, and then you highlight up and down.
Yeah.
There's so many different ancestries now. You can go lots of different directions. And let's say it's an owl creature, an owlkin or something. Look at all the different kinds of owls and the different colors and patterns. And once you get more comfortable with a paintbrush or use a pen, you can put tattoos, markings, all that kind of symbols and stuff on their arm, across their face, and it adds a lot of interest. And don't be afraid to mess up. You
Yeah.
can paint it again.
You
If
can
you
reprime it and move on.
That's right. And a lot of people strip their models, which means remove all the paint. Unless you are really thick, you don't have to worry about that. Just
No.
start over. Um,
Yeah.
if your paint is thick, then stripping the model might be necessary.
And I think too, there's nothing wrong with looking up images online and going, this is kind of what I'm thinking. Because sometimes it's hard. It's sometimes hard to judge what that shade is. But when you kind of have that physical representation, this is my idea of what's going to happen, and you can use it as a constant reference to what's happening on the mini. You can look and go, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I was wanting. There's tons of art out there that can be used as inspirations for things like that. So don't be afraid to reach out and try to copy somebody else's skin tone or the way they've done a shading or the way they've done something else. These mini painters are going to be happy that you did that. That's the whole reason they're out there. So don't be afraid to say, I really like how this person paints, and I'm going to try to do a few things in their style. That's okay.
Yeah. And if any of you have been traditionally trained as an artist or taken classes like me, um, reference material is required. So you want to have images like how does a cloak look under the leaves or behind somebody's hair? How does that contrast look? So color theory, right? The other thing to do that I've seen pro painters for miniatures do is they create a palette on a white piece of plastic or whatever, and they'll do the brown and they'll write down the color. If they've mixed it, what proportions they did. And they'll have that as their reference for their color palette for that miniature. So you know it's 2 parts brown, 1 part's blue. You know that you used um, imperial flesh, right? All these colors, and you have it written down, and it's your reference piece. So even as you're painting, you can create your own reference to use. And if you paint a test miniature first, write down the colors. So when you paint the rest, you already know what those colors are and what the proportions if you mix the colors. So a reference is key for all artistic endeavors. So we're going to wrap at this point. Belinda, any final words?
The biggest thing here is to have fun and don't worry. I've done this. I've watched, and I am an avid YouTube follower of a lot of painters, and it can be very discouraging because you watch some of these people just put out stuff that you're like, oh my goodness gracious. But at the same time, if you're not having fun, then scale it back and find what's fun about it. Uh, don't cripple yourself with trying to live up to the expectations of somebody else. Have fun with it and try something new. Even if it doesn't work out, it didn't work out. There's always another mini. There's 25,000 of them back there in my uh, bin of shame. There's always another orc to paint. So even if that one failed, just move on to the next orc and move on.
Absolutely. So great stuff, Belinda. Thank you for joining me this evening on Creative Goo. And I will see everybody next time.
Bye.